Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. Here's the president of the Lake George Battlefield Alliance, John Denuzzo.
Hi, everyone. This is John Denuzzo of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance. I'm welcoming again this week Bruce Venter, our trustee of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance and author of The Battle of Hubbardton and other works of history covering the 18th and 19th century. Bruce, we're talking about New Year's resolutions and places that history buffs really should see. And we want to confine our discussion this week to historic sites, Colonial Wars era, within the Lake George, Lake Champlain region. What are your top recommendations, places people should definitely go to?
Well, as I was saying in the previous recording there, I'm very interested in the 250th anniversary that's coming up, 250th anniversary of the founding of our country. And so in our area, we are extremely lucky to have major sites that people can visit related to the American Revolution. And as I said before, Fort Ticonderoga would be highly recommended for 2025 all the way through 2027. The fort, of course, is reconstructed. It's reconstructed of stone. It was originally a wooden fort at the time, just like Fort William Henry. But, of course, the logs don't last forever. So when they recreated it, they had to use stone, which lasted about 100 years. They're doing some reconstruction work now on the walls there. But Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point were instrumental in the American Revolution. Starting in 1775, and May 10th, actually, Ethan Allen captured the fort. As a result, all of the cannon that were there, gunpowder, other munitions, supplies for the Patriot cause. And so if you want to get an idea of, something that happened right in the beginning of the Revolution, you want to go to Fort Ticonderoga. Allen and his second cousin, Seth Warner, captured Crown Point within a day of the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. And Crown Point had a number of cannon there. Now, neither one of those forts was in very good shape at the time they were captured, and they didn't put up much of a resistance. But there were a number of cannon at Crown Point, too. I like Crown Point as the site. The walls of the fort are there, and the ruins of the barracks, the limestone barracks, but they've not tried to recreate the fort. There's also a French fort on the site, Fort St. Frederick, that was originally built in 1730, and they have the ruins of that fort available for you to see. That fort was used by the French to make raids into New England that were really terrible, decimating to the population of New England. You probably heard of the raid on Deerfield in 1704. That originated down from Canada and through Fort St. Frederick. The forts were captured in 1775. They were maintained by the Americans into 1776. We had the Battle of Valcour Island on Lake Champlain, which prevented, in some respects, Carleton from capturing Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point. He went back to Canada. And then in 1777, you had General Burgoyne with the famous plan to split the colonies, split New England from the rest of the colonies. And he actually captures Fort Ticonderoga relatively easily. The American Army could not defend the fort because they didn't have enough men to man the trenches. And they will retreat over to Mount Independence and then down to Castleton and eventually to Fort Edward, where they link up with General Schuyler.
Thank you. So we got Fort Ty, we've got Crown Point. What other sites would you recommend?
Well, I mentioned in the preview the Battle of Hubbardton. And why I like to have people look at the Battle of Hubbardton is that you can basically understand the battle from standing in two different sites. There is virtually no development, not like some of these Civil War battlefields down in Virginia, where they just are built over and what have you. And so we get a good sense of how the battle was fought because, like I said, you can stand on Monument Hill and get an idea of the British coming up the hill and the Americans on the other side, the rear guard action, again, led by Seth Warner. And, it was a fight for several hours, 3 hours maybe. And it was pretty horrendous fighting. They were fighting at 60 yards apiece, and and then if you, from the visitor center, if you take a right and then another right and go down an old dirt road, you can see where the battle started. You can see where the British came through the saddle of Sergeant Hill. So you can get a really good idea of what it was like in 1777, because there's virtually nothing around. There is a visitor center there, and they have a diorama, and they have some maps, and I think they have a film there, and they have a little bookstore. But for all intents and purposes, you are out in the middle of where the battle actually was fought, and without impediment to your sight view.
Do you know, Bruce, I mean, is the Battle of Hubbardton Visitor Center, is that open in the wintertime, or you have to wait till spring?
No, it's only open from about mid-May to mid-October, I think. And it's only open a couple of days a week, but that doesn't prevent you from going to the battlefield. They don't lock a gate or anything like that. You can pull into the parking lot, and you can walk Monument Hill. You can walk down to Sucker Brook and like that, even if they're not open. I wish that they did bush hog a path across Sucker Brook. They haven't been doing that lately. It's a shame, because if there was a path cut through, you could cross Sucker Brook and then walk up into the saddle. I've done that with a tour group, but we ended up having to get it done ourselves and build a bridge ourselves in order to get across there. But it's quite the thing to do, get up into that saddle and see where the Americans were firing on the British with the initial part of the battle.
Okay, great. Any other sites you'd recommend within the region?
Absolutely, you got to go to the battlefield at Saratoga. It's a magnificent battlefield. It's, I think, 3,400 acres. You may have to go more than once, and you want to study up on it. I think that the one drawback of the Saratoga battlefield is that the tour road, the official parks tour road, runs in a direction that doesn't really lend itself chronologically to the battle. That makes it a little bit different for people if it's their first time there. It's difficult to understand. But they have put up new signage as of last year, and I believe that Don Triani, the famous military artist, did the graphics for it. And I know that Eric Schnitzer, the park ranger, had a lot to do with writing the narrative of those signs. But you just have to understand that when you're riding the tour road, you actually get to the second battle of Saratoga before you get to the first battle. So you got to just sort of put that out of your mind and get right to Freeman's Farm and start there, and then go do the battlefield road again. I think that is the turning point of the American Revolution. One of the key battles of world history is right 30 minutes from Lake George. Anybody that misses it they should not miss it. They should not miss it.
Excellent. And that visitor center is open year-round, I presume?
Yeah, it's probably closed on major holidays like Christmas or something like that, but otherwise it is open 7 days a week, yes.
Any other final thoughts, Bruce, before we close down this segment?
I should mention, while we're talking about the Lake George Battlefield Park, is that Fort George is in the park, and that played a factor in the Revolution. Henry Knox came through there with his cannon in 1775, so we can celebrate that next year. And then in 1777, the British captured that fort after the Americans evacuated it, and they held it as part of their supply line from Canada to Ticonderoga to Diamond Island to Fort George, and then down the military road to Fort Edward, following behind in the wake of Burgoyne's army. So don't miss Fort George. It's a gem that not everybody sees.
Thank you. And a reminder about Fort George, Lake George Battlefield Park. The visitor center is not open over the winter, except for special occasions, but there's a new set of park orientation signs and maps that people can take from a pouch and do self-guided tours that you can walk into the park throughout the year. You might not be able to drive, but you can see the Fort George ruins and the sculptures and other things that make our battlefield park very special. Okay, thanks again, Bruce. We'll see you next week. And our reminder, our LakeGeorgeBattlefieldPark.org website is up and running. You can get a lot of information about the sites we're talking about.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. For more on this topic, check out the Lake George Battlefield Alliance podcast, a weekly feature on Lake FM 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. For more information, go to lakegeorgebattlefield.org and tune in every Saturday morning for Lake George Battlefield Moments.